Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Diplomatic Enclave. I am your host, Umar Khalid Butt. As you know, education is the crux of development in any nation, in any society. And when you go to specialized education, it becomes even more important for people to understand it and to understand the complexity of it and to grasp it properly. And now, with the advent of social media, people across the world know each other, know the different forms of education, and know how education needs to be completed and what are the different diversities in education that one needs to be aware of. Also, with diversity comes complexity. So, there are a lot of questions that comes in one's mind, especially when it comes to specialized education. Today, I have the honor of having two very interesting guests with me. They've come from across the world, across the 7 seas, if I might say, to attend an international conference on medical education here in Islamabad. This conference is being held after more or less a decade in our country, and it's very important for people across the world to understand how medicine has evolved in Pakistan, and for the medical professionals and educationists who are here based in Pakistan to also understand those professionals and how they have evolved and how their system has evolved over the decades and years, and how these professionals can work together for the benefit of mankind. That is the essence of today's show. And before I go even further, let me introduce my two guests to you, my two renowned guests. My first guest is Ma'am Brownell Anderson. They call you Brownie. I'll ask you why they call you. You're Vice President International Programs at the National Board of Medical Examiners in the US. So if anybody wants to do his or her USMLE, you're the one who's in charge of that. So you take very care of how the people get involved and how they pass that and whether they're really competent enough to go through those education systems. You're also working with medical schools and organizations in Brazil. You've worked for 27 years at the Association of American Medical Colleges. You've also on the faculty of the Arabian Gulf University for several years. So thank you very much today to have graced us with your presence.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Our second guest comes from the United Kingdom. You are a medical practitioner, Dr. Trudie Roberts. You've graduated from Manchester with a degree in medicine, BSc in anatomy, one subject that I was always afraid of when I was studying. Let me tell you very frankly, Dr. Trudie. You are a senior lecturer in transplant immunology. You've been at the University of Manchester. And you have been appointed as Professor of Medical Education at the University of Leeds in the year 2000. In 2013, you became the President of the Association of Medical Education in Europe. And your areas of competence include training and education. You've been awarded a fellowship in the Academy of Medical Educators as well in 2013. And you've also received the Miles Award at the Asia Pacific Medical Education Conference. So, I mean, I'm so privileged to have two wonderful, competent women today on this show. So without further ado, let's begin our program. Ma'am Brownell, you come from the US and you are in charge of the whole educational curriculum of the medical professionals who enter the field in the United States. A lot of students go from Pakistan for their USMLEs, and of course we know that you're in charge of that. Has the system of undergoing these USMLEs, because I remember they were used to be in 3 parts, has that evolved over the decades? And do you make a constant effort to also update and upgrade the questions and the criteria on which the people are taken in the system in the US?
Absolutely. The examination itself used to be the National Board examination and the Federation of State Medical Boards, which gives the license. The National Board does not give the license to practice. In 1988, I believe, the Federation and the National Board came together to create the United States Medical Licensure Exam. And so that in and of itself was a major difference. The format of the questions has changed over the years. And in 1992, a clinical skills component was added to the licensure examination. So students take, with the computer, and you can take the exam anywhere in the world, the first step, which focuses on the sciences basic to medicine, like your favorite anatomy. And then in the second step, it's focused on clinical medicine with a clinical skills examination, and students have to interact with a standardized patient. And they are observed and they are evaluated by the standardized patient as well as the observer. And then once they graduate from medical school, they take the third step, which acknowledges that they are ready to practice without supervision. So the format of the questions has changed, the kind of examination that is required has changed, and the content continues to evolve.
And on what level does it continue to evolve, Brownlee? Does it continue to evolve at a yearly level, even at a monthly level? What is the emphasis that you put on as far as the evolution of medical education is concerned?
It would be almost impossible to have it change on a monthly level because the exam is standardized so that everyone who takes it and passes it, we're able to say has met a minimum set of competencies. But the exam committees, and these are committees made of faculty from medical schools. The staff of the NBME does not prepare the exam. It's the faculty of the schools. And there are different committees that meet annually to review the materials, update it, write new questions, all of which then have to be standardized and scored and then put on the exam. So it's quite a process.
It's quite a process. Dr. Trudie, is that as difficult or evolving a process in the British system as it is in the US?
Well, the British system is about to change quite radically. Up until now, each medical school had its own finals examinations, which consisted, similar to how Brownlee's outlined, which is a knowledge-based test, a clinical OSCE, where their stations are reflecting of the work they will be doing when they graduate, and then also some in-course assessments, workplace-based assessments. So each medical school did its own thing. And all the medical schools were visited and quality assured by the General Medical Council. But now we're actually going to go to a national licensing examination, and that will come in 2021.
How will that change the medical education system?
In quite an interesting way, really. One of the things that's first going to happen is the question bank will be shared. So it will be easier to actually have a huge question bank. If you consider there are 43 medical schools in the United Kingdom, each one developing its own question bank. If we can then pool those all together, you could see that we could actually publish all those questions, and then there couldn't be any cheating because students could, if they learned, say we had 20,000 questions, if students could learn 20,000 questions, the answers to those, they would have learnt the knowledge underpinning medicine. So that's an advantage. The clinical skills, the OSCE examination, we're toying with whether it should be a national one, so it's at national centres where it be standardised, or whether there should be a component from each medical school. If you have a national one, as Brownlee's outlined, you tend to use simulated patients. But then you don't have real patients. And real patients are interesting. You'll remember them. They're interesting and they're messy, and they don't always tell you the answer you're looking for. So, we're looking to see how we can make it as authentic as possible, but as standardised as possible, because as Brownlee said, that's really important.
All right. Brownell Anderson, do answering 20,000 questions or understanding the answers to 20,000 questions suffice being a medical practitioner in your point of view? How can you make a medical student, whether it be a male or female, understand that he or she has a proper grasp on what the topic is all about? Because the questions are varied, of course, on different topics. But how do you make sure or ensure that the student who's undergoing the examination, when he or she goes through it, if he passes it, it is because he or she understands all the different aspects of medicine and the different topics that he or she has learned?
I think that the examination serves a purpose, which is to be able to say to the public that this physician, whether he or she is from a United States educational system or a Pakistan system, has met minimum competencies. I don't think that anyone suggests that passing this exam means that you have full knowledge of everything. In fact, the medical education process is one of continuous and lifelong learning. And so the key is really to help the student understand that it's not a matter of memorizing this for the examination. You pass this examination, but it's because you have absorbed a great deal of information through your medical education program, and you will continue to do so in your postgraduate work and then in practice. So I don't think that there's ever the sense that passing this exam means that you have
But it does mean
everything.
to say that you have a certain grasp on the topics. You have understood what you have read.
Fundamentals, it means if you've passed it that you understand and can apply. That's why the format of the questions are different. They're not straight true false. We don't use true false. There are vignettes that set out a clinical situation, and the examinee has to put some information together in order to understand which is the correct response. And so it is a grasp of fundamental components of medicine, yes.
How much of the medical components are grasped in the current education system in the UK, and how is that going to change in 2020, Trudie?
I think the changes will be largely political, and we may come back to those things. But I think just to build on what Brownie has said, we're no longer asking for just pure knowledge in itself. So, you know, I don't know if it was similar for you, but, you know, what are the 15 causes of atrial fibrillation? That in of itself is not uninteresting, but it's the application of knowledge. So as Brownie says, it's actually the clinical scenario, and not just having that knowledge, but using that knowledge in this scenario, what would you do? So it's much more about the application of knowledge, I think. Now, we blueprint our examinations, so we say, what are the most important things? Because as you're alluding to, the knowledge base for medicine is vast. But we've got to think about what these undergraduate students are going into, what their role will be, and what you might expect from their role at that time. What do they need to know? And what's the essential things that one needs to know? So that's how we blueprint our exam, to have the most important knowledge. Because you alluded to it in your introduction, with the internet now and with social media, so much of knowledge is actually available to everyone.
And we don't know how much of that knowledge is really usable, how much of that knowledge is really correct, and how much of disinformation is present there.
Sure. And so actually you can see that one of the things that we should be training modern doctors to do is to be able to look at the information that's available on the internet and look at its validity and its reliability, because then we can help our patients. Our patients are not necessarily in a position to understand that, you know, something from, oh, I don't know, Mrs. Miggins' you know, guide to healthcare is perhaps different than Harrison's textbook. And so we need to be able to help our patients. What the internet has done is completely revolutionized medicine, in actual fact. Prior to the internet, all the information that you got about your condition came through a medical or a healthcare professional.
Exactly. Or through a book that you bought or you somebody gave to you.
Yes. And if you think back to the Reformation in Europe, okay, that before the Bible, for us in Christianity, was printed in English and was printed on with printing presses, all the information about religion came through religious clerics. Now, what happened in those times was suddenly the Bible was printed in, was written in English, translated into English, and Gutenberg invented the printing press. Of course, you'll remember he was burnt at the stake for his troubles. Now, if we fast forward to the modern day, the internet has allowed all that information about medicine to be available to anybody and everyone. But of course, it's quite hard to sometimes
and you
interpret
don't burn
that.
the people on the stake now.
Not yet.
Right.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Tin Berners-Lee, we may do in later time. And the same thing with social media. It's a huge force for good, but people need to understand its limitations. And I think that so the role of the doctor is actually going to be much more about guiding patients through all this morass of information.
All right. Guiding people through this mirage of information, especially with the advent of internet and social media, and you can search for any keyword in medicine and you'll get 1,000 articles on that, whether they be from professional sources or non-professional sources, or even by articles written by persons. How do you guide the students once they've gone through the USMLEs, once they've passed them, and once they kind of go towards a certain degree or a certain profession when they enter the medical profession officially in the US? How do you people guide them further so that they are not misled in one way or the other by disinformation?
Well, if I may, I want to step back from
Please.
the USMLE because the USMLE is a licensure exam. It is to say to the public, your physician has met these standards. In the medical education program is where the question that you're asking happens. And it begins with the understanding, and this is one of the most fundamental changes in medicine, in medical education. And that's the role of the educator from one of delivering information. We used to call it the parade of stars. In chemistry, I had a professor who had been a Nobel Prize contender, and he was teaching freshman chemistry. So we had the parade of stars. We heard about his particular area. Now the role of the educator is to engage the student and to help them understand how, from the very beginning, to separate what is fact, what is plausible, and what is probably not accurate at all through all of the different sources of information. And one of the topics we haven't even touched on is the whole area of artificial intelligence.
Exactly.
And the role that that is playing and will
And
play
will be playing
in
the
medicine.
future. Yes,
exactly.
exactly.
So it really, it's not about the USMLE, it's really about what the students get in medical school, the kind of training that they have. It requires faculty development, it requires engaging the faculty and helping them understand what their role is in working with the students to give them these skills. And then in the States, we have residency, a minimum of 3 years that follows graduation from medical school, and then specialization. So this has to be done throughout this educational process.
And this educational process, of course, continues throughout the life, as you said, in any,
Exactly.
especially in the medical education field, you need to be constantly updated on the
Yes.
different techniques, on the different philosophies, on the different things that have come out, because it's an ever-evolving, how should I say, method of education. Trudie, let's come to you. Development of students begins from the first day they enter the medical school. Now, you've been a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester. Now, since 2000, you were at the University of Leeds. How much of that evolution have you seen? And what are the criteria that you also put in as far as evolving the system of education, medical education is concerned in your universities that you've been associated with?
Well, I think that students, when they come into a medical degree, I see them in their freshman week, which is their first week. And I love seeing them like that. I really become very energized by it because they are so altruistic, they're so energetic, they're going to cure cancer by Christmas, they're going to solve the problems of the NHS, and people like me need to step aside because I've had my chance and I've failed. And I love it. I love futile optimism in the face of overwhelming odds. And I think it's really important, though, to not lose that spark that they're going to change things. You have to, I think, moderate it with some, reality checks. But on the other hand, I would hate to see people lose that absolute determination and passion that they are going to change people's lives. And that's why they come into medicine.
Exactly.
So they themselves change as they come through.
And how do you change how do you also get the faculty to update themselves? Because, you know, faculty means whether it be you or your other colleagues, they've come from a certain,
Yes,
let's be
age,
very
I know.
frank, era, a certain time period where the medical education system was different. And as we're discussing, this education system evolves every couple of years.
Yeah.
There are new things that come up, there are new evolutions, there are new theories, new possibilities. How do you also work with your faculty in order to keep them updated and give them the resolve to update themselves?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. In their clinical arena, if they're clinicians, in their clinical arena, they're keeping up to date because of their continued professional development. And so their expertise is increasing in that their own area, and I don't have concerns about that. But in terms of the way they teach, it's very easy to teach the way you were taught, and yet we know now that teaching again evolves, and how you get people to not memorize but understand, deep understanding. And so we put on a lot of faculty development for our teachers so that they are actually aware of newer ways of teaching. So let me give you an example of something that we did that went wrong. I'll tell you the stories that go wrong, because one learns most from those. As we've just been discussing, actually now, if you have a mobile device, a smartphone, which 99% of people, certainly I think in the world now, the time things are going up, you have in your hand access to all the knowledge since civilization began. So that's what students had. So some years ago, we decided that what we would do would be for our very main clinical years, we would give students an iPhone. And on that iPhone, we would load resources. So things like Up to Date,
Right.
which is a program that a lot of physicians use because it gives you the most up-to-date treatment for various conditions. And what we wanted to do was to encourage bedside learning, because when you're at the bedside, and you'll remember this, Omar, you'll think, I don't know what these drugs are. When I go back to my student accommodation, I'll look them up. And then, of course, a million other things come between you and that, and you don't do it, whatever. Whereas if you could look it up at the side of that patient, that cements the learning.
Exactly.
Exactly.
That refreshes your memory, and that makes you understand and grasp it much quicker.
That's right, exactly. And this sort of just-in-time learning, patient-related learning. So if you had a smart device, you could actually look it up, and then what would... So we gave everybody, we have about 250 to 280 students, all had an iPhone device. Because at that stage, and it's some years ago now, they didn't have one that was of sufficient sophistication. They went onto the wards with them, and we could monitor when people were using them, not individually, but as a cohort. And we found that they were not using them at the bedside.
And why was that?
Well, that's what the question we asked ourselves. And that was because when they took them out at the bedside, their clinical teacher said, put that away. How rude is that? Fancy going on Facebook or Twittering or whatever it is. And so we had to educate the clinicians to say, students will be looking up treatments, drugs and things like that. And if you want them to look something up, ask them. And we also had to reassure patients as well, because patients themselves were thinking, I'm talking to them, why are they getting out their phone? And so for a while we had to have a cover for their iPhone that said Leeds University learning device. Now it's much better. But what we should have done was to actually educate our patients and our staff beforehand that this was coming. This would be something that they could utilise as well. So it taught us a great deal about clinicians and others needing to understand modern educational techniques.
All right, Professor Brownell, modern educational techniques in the US, how much of those are updated on a regular level? And if they are, how much of they are grasped by the faculty in different universities in the US?
Well, I am known for saying if you've seen one medical school in the US, you've seen one medical school. There's enormous variation in the schools, and the degree of change, both in terms of new medical schools that have been created, in the standards that are used for accreditation of those programs, and the programs themselves, the changes in the last 10 years have been monumental. I published in 2000 and then again in 2010 a compendium of the curricula, programs, and assessment of all the medical schools in the US and Canada. And just comparing the changes that happened in 10 years is phenomenal. And I think that to your question, one of the things that has happened in the US and in Canada, and also I think in the UK, but Trudie, you can speak to this, is a recognition of the scholarship of education, that the faculty of the medical school are recognized for their research, for clinical care, and also for their contributions to teaching. There are a number of schools that have what are called academies for the faculty, and it's an honor to be inducted into the academy, and it's based on your, as you say, grasping these fundamentals, being able to create innovative approaches to education, getting student evaluations that are top of the mark. So there's much more attention paid to the role of the faculty member as educator, and that's made a profound difference in their grasping it.
Trudie, there's one thing to make somebody a good educationist or a good student or a good professional. There's another aspect of it, to make him or her a good human being, to make him or her more humane. That this is a difference that in many countries of the world, people don't understand. They become very good professionals in their field, but they don't become good human beings. And when especially you're in the medical profession, you need to be a very good human being, and then you need to be a very good professional, because you need to associate yourself with your patient, whoever he or she is, whether he or she is a nice, kind person or an unkind person. You have to deal with them with the same kindness and with the same maturity as you would do otherwise. Is that also part of the curriculum of the faculty to teach the students, and of the students when they come out? Are they also judged on that criteria?
Yes, I think what you're referring to is professionalism.
Exactly.
And
and in the medical profession, it becomes even more pertinent, this side of professionalism.
I think that we, over the last decade, I would say, that we've become much more aware of how important this is. And if we look at the complaints to the regulator about doctors, certainly in the UK and I think also in the US, most of them are not necessarily about technical expertise or knowledge. It's about the lack of professionalism. And so we've started to think about this in much more detail. And I think certainly in the UK we were, because it's quite a difficult thing to assess. How do you assess somebody's professionalism? And although you've talked about them being a good person, and that's right, you know, we don't want saints, because we are normal and flawed human beings.
That is true.
Of course.
But sometimes, somewhere, Trudie, we are, as doctors, I have seen that always, whenever, even me, myself, when I go as a patient to any doctor, I am, as my grandmother used to say, 50% cured if the doctor is nice to me, if he or she understands me, listens to me.
Yep.
And then the 50% is the treatment that is given to me. So how much of that is
So I think
prevalent?
that's becoming much more important these days. We stress and emphasize professionalism and the development of it. I think, you know, we used to think that it would osmose into people. They would come into a medical school, and because they would be surrounded by, you know, good doctors, it would osmose into people. We know that doesn't happen. I could stand next to, you know, the best doctor in Leeds, and it wouldn't osmose into me. So we need to actually talk about it in detail. We need to characterize it. What are the sort of qualities that we're looking for? And you've alluded to some of those things. So that listening skills, okay, non-judgmental skills, because as you say, there are people that you don't like who you treat, and that was a great revelation to me when I became a doctor. Actually, I had this idea. Of course, I would go around shimmering, putting, you know, my hand on people who would be immediately grateful and be cured. And sadly, that didn't happen. And I had to treat people for whom our value systems were completely different. But that's the test to become a real professional, is where you put that aside and you treat them, in that non-judgmental way. And so we're emphasising this now, and we are assessing it, because if students, and this is a generalisation, students see it's important if you teach it rather than just allude to it, and they think it's very, very important, of course, if you assess it too. Now, you've got to think of what levels of professionalism you can expect. So in the UK, for the most part, we're taking 18-year-olds into our medical school. Some of them are older, but the vast majority will be 18-year-olds. And I don't know if you have children yourself, Omar, but if you have adolescents, which is what 18-year-olds are, they are an interesting group of people who push against society, who try things out and so forth. And so when they come in, they may turn up late to various things and so forth. Now, I don't approve of that, and we need to talk about that. But if I was still seeing that in the later years, when patients were involved in a clinic or in a surgery, then that's much more worrying, because they haven't developed, they haven't internalized the need for professional respect, time management and all those things. So I think we're slightly more forgiving in the earlier years. We still talk about it a lot, but we expect to see professional development as they go through.
All right, that's very interesting, professional development as one goes through. Now, Professor Brownell, in the different university schools, as you said, every school is different in the United States, and there are a plethora of medical schools and institutes in the United States. Now, a student might be brilliant in medicine. He or she might be brilliant, but he or she might not understand another human correctly. Is it also very important for a medical practitioner or somebody who studies medicine to be a good psychologist, at the same time to understand human psychology? Do you also emphasize on that during the teaching process?
I don't know that I would characterize it as human psychology that is emphasized. I think that the approach that is taken is focusing on communications, the ability to make a connection and engage, and all the things that Trudie said about being able to do what is the right thing for the patient, regardless of anything that you as an individual may feel. So it's important to put the patient first. I think that's the key. We call it patient-centered care, and that has been a significant change as well in medical education.
Put the patient first. I think that is very important. Professor Brownell Anderson, Professor Trudie Roberts, we are having a very interesting conversation on the whole system of medical education and ethics that need to be associated with the medical education. We'll be right back after a short break. Stay tuned right here on PTV World. Welcome back. You're watching Diplomatic Enclave. I'm your host, Khalid Butt, and we are discussing the possibilities and the realms of medical education in and across the world with two educationists in that field from the United States and the United Kingdom. And we'll now go to Professor Trudie Roberts. Now, Trudie, you've been the president of medical education at the Leeds University, and you've also been associated with the medical education in European countries. Which brings me to a very interesting question. Well, Europe have more or less the same values, the countries that are there, but people cross borders to pursue medical education in one country or the other. But there are students that go from Asia, from Pakistan, from India, from other countries, from Africa, to the United Kingdom or the United States to pursue education. Crossing borders to pursue a field such as medical education, do you feel that they need to be also taught as far as the different values of the system are concerned, or do you feel that they come with their set of values that get enhanced in your educational system?
Well, I think in the UK and in the US as well, we are very much dependent on international medical graduates. We want them to come and work with us. Right. And not only do we want them to come and work with us, but we want them to be successful. So it's not a question of, you must come and then we don't give you any induction, we don't support you. And I think that their cultures are different around the world. Although we all want to put the patient at the centre of everything we do, there are certain nuances. So, for example, in some cultures, it wouldn't be polite to actually engage with eye contact with a patient. Yet within Europe and with the US, we think this is really important to show that you're actually interested, that you're listening to somebody.
Apart from when you're in a bus or in a metro.
Touché. So I think there is a certain level of enculturation, which says this is the way we do things here in our culture. And it doesn't mean to say that the way you've done things before is wrong, it's just different. And I think that's sometimes where people, when they move cultures, if they're not given support and induction, I think that's where things can go wrong. Now, sometimes that can be quite difficult, because if you're coming at in a residency situation, you suddenly start work in a different environment. And in the UK, if you come and you work as a middle grade trainee, you're given very little in the way of induction. And so I think we've been starting to think through how we could do that. People can't come over for a whole week beforehand or a month beforehand, because they'll be finishing one training role here in Pakistan and then coming to start very quickly in the UK. So we're beginning to think about how we might do that using modern technology. So now, can we put somebody in an AR or a VR, virtual reality situation, so that they could actually do a ward round with the group that they're going to join? Because we can actually envisage that.
That's very interesting.
And so actually, if we're really successful, what will happen is when that trainee moves and starts their first day of work, it will just be like deja vu. They'll think, I've been here before. I know where to hang my coat up. I know where to park my car. I know where to get the coffee. I've seen the people here that I'm going to be working with because they've spoken to me in a virtual environment. So I think that actually modern technology can help us prepare people better for this.
And I can see that you've got an iWatch on you, and with the latest technologies, the watches can also calculate your ECG, they can see your blood pressure, and you see the medical technology also advances by what you even wear. So that the technology is only ever rapidly advancing with time.
Indeed. I see that Apple's latest patent that was submitted a couple of days ago, they are actually now they've done something to put in a monitoring system in a stretching fabric. So you may actually be wearing something that's telling you about whether you're stressed or not. So the fact that your underclothes could tell you how stressed you are is really a slightly peculiar thing.
That could put a lot of people at a certain disadvantage as well. And I'm sure, Professor Brownell, you agree with me. Now, Professor Brownell, you've been in Brazil, in and out, teaching at different medical schools associated with them. You've been also at the faculty of the Arabian Gulf University. So you know a lot of how people think, how people pursue their educational processes in the different parts of the world. How easy or difficult is to assimilate them together under one system in the US?
Well, you used a very important word, which is system. And in fact, in the US, we are now focusing on the science of the healthcare system. And there's in fact a new assessment of that, understanding the hospital system, all the things that Trudie described, to be able to bring people together. I think that it is not difficult to do that. I think what's important and what's really valued, as Trudie said, we want international medical graduates. 25% of the healthcare of the physician population in the United States right now is from international medical graduates. And we value the different approaches. We were talking before the break about compassion, and one of the things that I've noticed, particularly when I lived in the Middle East, is the importance of family and the focus on family. And that can change one's perspective and one's approach to patient care in a very positive way. And that can model behavior for people who graduated in US medical schools and might not have had quite the same inculcation. So it's a very positive thing. It's not a difficult thing, and we recognize the different qualities and values that people bring to this.
All right, which brings me to another very important question, that is ranking of schools or universities. Now, you said, Professor Brownell, that there are loads and loads of medical schools in the US. How do you rank those medical schools in the US? What are the criteria, and how should one apply the same criteria internationally? I'll ask you that question, I'll go to Trudie.
Okay, well, the answer is we don't rank medical schools.
All right.
Again, because they are so different, there are schools that are focused on graduating physicians who will be general practitioners. There are schools that are focused on graduating physicians who will be research scientists and Nobel Prize winners. So to rank them is to compare apples and oranges. There are not criteria
to
rank
rank
them.
similar medical schools or universities, I mean, that are going to take out similar sets of graduates?
I think we categorize them, we
all
don't
right.
rank them.
All right.
And all of the schools in the US are accredited by the same standards. And so those standards then are applied to everyone. And there's no difference. Again, the difference is the emphasis that the mission of the school has.
All right. Does that apply to the United Kingdom as well?
Yes, I think it does. I'll come back to ranking in a moment because we rank students, and that's, I think, pernicious, and I'll explain why I think that. I think within medical schools, now we've gone to competency-based outcomes. So we can tell all the medical schools what level of knowledge, skills and professional behaviour we expect from their graduates. The way they get to that may be different. So some schools have a problem-based learning curriculum, some schools have a case-based learning, some have an integrated system. And of course that may suit different learners. And actually that's a very good thing. As long as they're all getting to this minimum standard, it doesn't really matter how you get there, I think.
All right.
So, and I would say that actually having the diversity of teaching and education is a very good thing. Now, so as Brownie's just said, in the UK, all the medical schools are quality assured, so there isn't a ranking for that. But however, we are required to rank our students within the medical school. So for us in the final year, there are 280 students and they'll be ranked into deciles. Okay, now, I'm sure you would have been, Omar, you were in the top decile. That would have been very good, of course. You would have felt very good about yourself. If you're in the bottom decile, you may not feel so good about yourself, despite the fact that you have actually achieved that competency. Doesn't mean to say you'll be a bad doctor. And actually then, what happens is all the medical students in the country are ranked. So we graduate about 6,500 medical school students every year. So if you're number one, you must feel fantastic.
Exactly.
If you are 6,500th, you may not feel so good about yourself. So what are we doing to young people who are highly talented and highly able by telling them you're the bottom of the pile, even though, of course, that level is so high that they will make very good doctors. And we do that because that's the way that people are assigned to jobs in the immediate postgraduate arena. It causes pernicious behaviour. People then will say, I don't want to work with this tutorial group because there are people in there with dyslexia and I don't want to work with them because that will, pull my overall grade down. And these are from people who we want to be part of the caring community.
Exactly.
And so, people can do anything to actually get into that top ranking. I've heard of where students will hide books in the library so that other people can't find them. It actually drives very pernicious behaviour, and I think it's absolutely wrong. It's used to solve a problem where we need to actually look at the problem itself. This is not a way to do it. And some years ago, I spoke to a very influential dean who said, none of my students in this medical school will be in the bottom decile. Well, of course, statistically, that's impossible. But he was adamant about this. So the staff said, how can we do this? Our jobs are on the line here. So I my answer was, you'll just have to have 11 deciles and then there'll be nobody in the 11th decile. I couldn't think of anything else. So you can see it's pernicious. It's not a good thing at all.
But how can you, one, improve on that, Professor Brownell, around the world, not just in the US, not in the UK, but also across the world, make people understand whether you are at the top of the class or at the bottom of the class, but that if you graduate, that you'll become a good physician in the long run if you are competent, if you continue in the same way, and if you are humane enough and you have the certain values that go with your profession.
How do we make people understand that? I think part of it depends on the specialty that you choose.
All right.
And in the States, we are getting into an area that is challenging in the conversation because much of the way that people perceive specialties is based on who's paid the most. And so there's a great deal of competition to get into certain specialties, and that then translates to you are a better doctor than someone who is in general practice.
And a lot of private clinics then take those doctors who earn a lot of money for their previous establishments. They say, oh, we need to take that doctor for a higher pay because he brings us such a lot of money per year.
Yes, that is a, to use Trudie's words, that is a pernicious issue. And in fact, one could argue that someone who's a general practitioner has to have much more knowledge about many more things and how to apply that knowledge and translate that knowledge to a diagnosis or a referral than the very highly specialized person who does surgery on the left-hand ring finger. And so I think that the question you ask, it represents a real challenge that is bound up with the way people are reimbursed and then how that translates to the perception that we have about their abilities.
Now, Professor Brownell and Professor Trudie, both of you are in Pakistan. You are attending a conference on medical education. How can developed countries and developing countries such as ours join hands to either build a consortium or to work together to deal with different challenges that occupy the medical health professionals around the world? Because I think the challenges remain universal. I'll begin with you, Professor Brownell, and then we'll go to Professor Trudie.
Well, I think there actually are examples of schools around the world that have, as you say, joined hands to develop educational programs and, most importantly, to learn from each other, to recognize that, for instance, in resource-challenged countries, there's a great deal that those of us in much more resource-rich countries can learn about dealing with something like an epidemic. So that has begun to happen already. Trudie has some examples, I know, of work that's underway. But for instance, the work that we're doing in Brazil, that has been not with medical schools working together so much, but the faculty from schools in the US working with some of the schools in Brazil to develop assessments, to learn about some of the issues in Brazil that we will be facing in the US before long. So I think that this is already happening, and it requires understanding. You said yourself, there's this common thread. Taking care of patients.
Exactly.
Medicine is common throughout the world. So we have an excellent starting point, and it's finding the time, it's finding the willingness, and sometimes the money to support these programs.
All right, Professor Trudie, let's also kind of emphasize on the educational aspect. How can also the different educational institutions across the world, especially in the field of medicine, join hands for people who don't have that much updated education or updated information in the medical education to get it through links between the developed and developing countries?
Well, I think the important things that you said, we're all focused on patients. So we're very privileged, really. We all know, and it's this focus on patients and carers and so forth. And I would re-emphasise what Brownie's just said. I think it can, if you're not careful, it can be seen that emerging countries always have to learn from developed countries, and that's not true at all.
Sometimes it's vice versa.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely. With, you know, frugal innovation and things like that. I've seen the most amazing innovation in other countries that I've thought, I'll bring this back to Leeds because it's been so good. And people have had to do that because they don't have the resources. So it is very much a two-way process. I think there are things like sharing staff, so that staff can come over for sabbaticals or for short time. Both ways, of course, staff from, say, from Pakistan coming over to the US and UK medical schools. But I think it should be for specific things. So it might be, we're looking at developing our skills in teaching communication skills. Let's come and have a look with a partner school about how they do it. And then we can see how we can take that back. And also, of course, students coming between different universities and different schools.
All right, all right. Professor Brownell, before you answer, I'd like to ask a final question from you before you answer this question. And this will be to the both of you. Do you feel that in the medical profession there needs to be a universal system of education so that a student in Pakistan understand what a student in the US or in Africa or in the United Kingdom is studying and kind of relates to him or her at the same level? I'd like your answer on the previous question, and then I'll go to the final question.
Well, what I was going to say about the previous question is that another aspect for education standpoint is technology and how much we can share virtually with schools in other parts of the world has a profound impact on joining hands and learning and sharing from with one another.
All right.
And actually, just to amplify that, in terms of conferences as well, sometimes we can actually transmit live stream plenary sessions from conferences, and we're looking at how people might present their work remotely, because travel is quite difficult sometimes.
Yes,
so
exactly.
if you could present the work that you've done in your own institution remotely, so you've done say a poster, an electronic poster, and you can be there through Zoom or Skype or something, you can present that.
Or virtual reality or artificial intelligence, one way or the other. Things are evolving at such a rapid pace that you never know how you can connect people, even in 3D maybe in a decade or so. You might be able to attend classes with the help of 3D technology. You being in Pakistan, I could be in the US, either teaching or even studying. And the possibilities are endless. And so I thank the both of you, Professor Brownell Anderson and Professor Trudie Roberts, to have come here, to share with us a lot of information about the medical profession, about medical ethics, about medical education in your respective countries and across the world, and how this whole educational process also binds countries, nations, societies together and evolves the societies together so that they become better and they become more humane and they become better for those who need to be treated in the long run. And it all starts from medical education. So to the both of you, I thank you and I wish you all the best for your stay in Pakistan. I'm sure you'll have a wonderful time. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this very interesting medical experience in the field of education and how that is important for countries across the world and how it is also important for different countries across the world to understand each other's system of education, whether it be normal education or specialized education, because that is how you bring people together, that is how you bind them together, and that is how you bring them to work for a common good, that is for the common good of mankind. Allah Hafiz.